Welcome to West Ohio Conversations. On today's episode, we join a conversation between Bishop Gregory von Palmer and conference communicator Kay Panevec. Bishop Palmer serves as a member of the Commission on a Way Forward. Today, he shares his thoughts about the present state of the church, rising anxiety leading up to the special session of General Conference, and the recent work of the Council of Bishops.
Well, Bishop, it certainly is an interesting time to be a United Methodist.
There's no doubt about that.
A year from now, the United Methodist Church could look dramatically differently than it does today. The special session of the General Conference will be over, and millions of United Methodists will be affected by the decisions that are made there. Do you believe that anxiety is building across our annual conference and across our denomination?
I do. I would be remiss in not acknowledging that I feel a palpable sense of anxiety as I move in and out of various meetings. And I also, however, feel profound creative energy in many of the settings where I find myself. We need more of the latter, the creative energy, and we need to ratchet down the anxiety. And we're invited to regulate ourselves, so to speak, out of the life and ministry and teachings of Jesus and out of what the scriptures say to us. Among my own resources are turning not only to scripture, but also to the hymns and song tradition of the church. And so many folks have heard me quote from the hymn 358 in our hymnal, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. And among the verses, one of them says, drop thy still dews of quietness till all our strivings cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. So that's my prayer for Gregory Palmer and my prayer for the church.
One of those places you've just returned from is the Council of Bishops. So what happened there?
We had an additional meeting, meaning a year ago that meeting was not scheduled. We began meeting on Sunday evening and concluded on yesterday, the 28th of February. And I would say it was a robust and an intense meeting. Both of those terms, in my judgment, are positive. Lots of the creative energy. I think there was, sort of some anxiety in that group, as would be understandable for a group of people who feel some responsibility to bring a leadership role to the life of the church, residentially and corporately. But it was a good meeting, wonderful times of worship, Eucharist every day, and then lots of conversation and examination of some of the options that we received to be thinking about creatively from the Commission on a Way Forward.
Were there any decisions made?
No fixed decisions other than confirming timelines. And most of those deadlines, if you will, are going to be coming up this spring and early summer. And I refer to the petition deadline to matters that have to go to, in the form to the General Conference. There is another meeting of the Commission on the Way Forward the third week of March. And then the Council of Bishops meets again beginning at the very end of April and proceeding until the 4th of May. It'll be at that meeting of the council that we'll make our decision about what it is we want to bring forward and offer to the church, get it into legislative form. And ultimately, the delegates will make that decision next February about what they see as the way forward for the United Methodist Church.
So once the council decides what they're going to bring forward, the delegations will be able to look at that material. And then what's the timeline there?
Timeline is once we submit our material to the Secretary of the General Conference, in between that meeting in May and the July 8th deadline, everything will be translated into all of the languages that the General Conference uses. So obviously be produced initially in English, that's my assumption, French, Swahili, and a couple of others. And there will be a very intentional simultaneity around this so that everybody's getting it at the same time globally. That's absolutely important, we believe, as a value and as a practice.
Now, will people within the annual conferences be able to submit other legislation?
That's a gray area for me. That conclusion will be reached in May, I think in a couple of forums, so I don't know that yet.
It's my understanding that both the Council of Bishops and the Commission on the Way Forward, all of those meetings are closed meetings. Some people would say there's a veil of secrecy behind all those meetings. What's the deal there?
Sure. We have had all of our meetings have not been open to the public. There have been lots of people that have come in and talked to us from caucus groups and theologians, church historians, and people that have helped us to see varying perspectives. And of course, there's been all sorts of online ways of making input to the commission as we've done that work. The strategy has been obviously not to make people think we're doing work in secret, but to allow people on the commission and subsequently the Council of Bishops, most of whose meetings are open, to be able to have continuous conversations. So if you meet for 3 or 4 days and people begin to report out, well, I heard Bishop Palmer say this on this date at the meeting, and then those same people, whether they're reporters or whether they're just people who are interested, are not there to hear what I may say on the 3rd day of the meeting. It could be unintentionally harmful, either to the person that's speaking or to the process. The intent is to allow there to be a sense of people being able to think and process out loud without necessarily being held hostage to something that they're really asking that amounts to a question and is not a statement until such time as an individual or a group is ready to say, here's our direction.
So basically, while they're still processing the information and trying to formulate their own opinions that will ultimately be voted on, correct?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I've seen through this process, as through any process where people are trying to say, here's the situation in which we find ourselves as an organization, an institution, or personally. And as I'm getting more inputs and engaged more in conversation with people that I'm not normally talking with, people evolve, people grow, people do alter their opinion or position on some things. Their core convictions may not change. Their capacity to say, I now really understand what my colleague or even an external voice might be putting forth because I've had a chance to rehearse it over and over again in dialogue and really robust, pretty fierce conversations. I may start off here positionally and then reach a place that says, that piece is not a deal breaker for me. And I've experienced that myself many times, not just in this conversation in the life of the church, but in other conversations as relationships have been built in the process of talking. The other thing is in the commission, because it is a profoundly diverse group in which the moderators very helpfully helped us to process people telling their stories. Not all people are willing to tell the depth and the nuances of their personal narrative, and in this case around human sexuality, if at every moment everyone is listening. But for the sake of the cause of moving the conversation forward, they're willing to tell it in a group that is bound by a particular covenant.
The Commission on the Way Forward offered 3 possibilities, or 3 sketches, or 3 options. I've heard it called different things. Are all 3 of those options still on the table?
In my judgment, yes. So all 3 sketches are still options. The conclusions, I pray, will be reached by the end of the council meeting, and they have to be because there are some real timelines out there. At varying times, the council and the commission have given energy in different places across those 3 sketches. And it's not always been the same or an equal amount of energy at every moment to each one of those, but all of them are still possibilities.
Will the Council on Bishops bring one option to the table finally at General Conference, or will they be bringing more than one?
I can truthfully say to you, Kay, that is a point to be decided at the late April, early May meeting. So I don't know that we'll get to one and only bring one forward. And I don't have the calculus to say the body is better served to have multiple choices from which to choose. So whether one comes or 2 come, et cetera, the key is that everything that comes before that body, the General Conference, will be treated as a motion or a proposal that has possibilities for amendment. So that's the thing that I would keep in mind if I were a delegate or a watcher of this process.
Anytime the conversation of human sexuality comes up, there can be rather passionate debate. Mm-hmm. How does the Council on Bishops deal with that passionate debate?
My experience is we're dealing with it more and more honestly with one another. And I think there have been several drivers to that, including what's going on in the residential areas. And so there's that sense of saying that as there have been shifts in the culture around the church, what is the appropriate and most healthy and most faithful responses of the church? A part of that is that your residential area is your residential area, and yet we're a part of a global connection. And so what happens here is not of no effect in other places. There is potential for ripple effect. So I've been very pleased at the increasing honesty and I would say intensity of our conversations, and that people are approaching it in a way that says a difference of opinion where there are differences does not have to undo relationships, and it does not have to undo the covenant. And certainly it need not undermine all of our commitment as bishops of the church, active and retired, to the mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Both the commission and the council have tried in earnest, and I believe will continue to say, this is a conversation we have to have about the faithful response of the United Methodist Church to human sexuality. And also to say it is an important but not the penultimate conversation. Our penultimate work is always around the mission. So we've even come at this missionally. How can we make choices, decisions, look at proposals that will maximize, as the vision, scope, and mission statement of this enterprise has said, maximize the presence and the witness of the United Methodist Church in as many places as possible in the world. That's creative tension.
Do you have any advice for people from our conference or people that use social media as a way to share their opinion or to express their pleasure or displeasure with the workings of the Commission on Way Forward and the Council of Bishops, or anything related to the church, really?
Well, I want to say that I believe that social media can be and has proven in a number of instances to be a huge gift in connecting people and connecting conversations and moving us in some cases out of profound isolation. I've also seen dramatic downsides to the misuses of social media, and they are not different than the misuses of the pen, except everything's instant and it's sort of like there forever, I've been told. So the advice given to me about social media some years ago was that if you put something on social media, you should assume that it's there forever, that it is recoverable by someone at some time in some place if they have enough skill and ingenuity. My mantra, so to speak, and my code for the use of social media is that I want to say things, offer things, and this is picking up on a theme of the Apostle Paul, that build up rather than tear down. And I think that's a Christian duty and a Christian obligation, even in the midst of places where not everybody understands everything the same way, or even, shall we say boldly, where there is disagreement. How can I engage that in a way that builds up the mission, builds up the church, and builds people rather than tears people down? So that's where I try to stand. That doesn't mean that the envelope can't and shouldn't be pushed in ways that some people would use the term prophetic. But there is probably a line, a chalk line, to use a sports metaphor, where what I perceive as prophetic can be experienced as destructive and tearing down, even if not intended. So my hope is that for all of us that use social media, and institutions use it, the annual conference uses it, the tests that I think we ought to use are, will it build up? Does it share information? We ought to check ourselves to say, do we have a blind side that this is possibly destructive to someone or unintentionally hurtful? I don't believe people sit around for the most part, and certainly not Christians, and certainly not United Methodist Christians, and certainly not West Ohio United Methodist Christians, sit around and plan to hurt and destroy other people. But in this instant world in which we live, when you hit send, when you hit post, it's gone. So as I say to people that are having relational problems sometimes, like in a family, there are no do-overs. There is always forgiveness, the possibility of forgiveness, and there is redemption. But you don't get a chance to do it again.
Even within our own conference, there's been some debate over holding conference events in church buildings where the pastor has a strong opinion about human sexuality one way or the other. Some would say it's insensitive or even harmful. Do you care to weigh in on that?
Sure. Number one, I would not ever and have not ever gone out of my way to use a particular location or facility to make a point that would be intentionally harmful to anyone or to any group of people. To the extent that sometimes there are unintended consequences, I would express regret wherever that's appropriate. Often decisions about conference events are fairly utilitarian. It's about scope and scale of space and capacity for hosting the meeting technologically, et cetera, et cetera. And those tend to be the drivers. And I think if any of us look at a calendar, for example, of the conference, meetings end up getting held all over the place in all sorts of churches where sometimes those leaders, pastoral leaders in those churches, have been spokespersons for strong positions on things. And sometimes there are people that are off the radar. The pastors and the lay people are people off the radar, but it was the right location for another reason. So those are the drivers of those kinds of decisions. And I hope that we'll keep making wise decisions. And if there have been decisions that aren't wise, that we'll think them through in future opportunities. As I said, there are no do-overs and et cetera. I would want to say that I want to, in my role, and to the extent I'm involved in things, my role is, we've got a lot of strong opinions in the United Methodist Church. Surprise, surprise, surprise. A lot of them have voice in the West Ohio Conference. We're a large conference, a diverse conference. That's not unexpected, and it's neither right nor wrong. It's the way it is. And we have churches that have lots of positions on lots of subjects. And I would say not just around the church's response to human sexual difference. And one of my things that I try to keep in mind is that I am the bishop of all the people. I want to be the bishop of all the people of West Ohio. I try to be. I'm sure there are times when somebody believes that I've not lived up to that. And so I don't have anything that says for me there's a place that I won't go to, meaning as I do Sunday morning engagements, confirmations, preachings, building confirmations, et cetera. I just can't have that filter on me as I move around the conference and feel like I've kept my vows of consecration.
You once said that the majority of the mail you receive is about human sexuality. Is that still true today?
Yeah, here's the nuance. The majority of the mail I receive on, quote, social issues, unquote, is around human sexuality. It still runs about 9-1. So if you take 10 pieces of mail, 9 of them are going to be about that and not straight. There are occasional blips on the screen where that varies. And in some regards, whether I like the letter or don't like the letter, it's actually refreshing. And that gives me a little pause, however, that the intensity and the volume of what people choose to write to me about, when they're not writing about their own local church and, we love the pastor, don't move him or her, or how soon could you get this pastor out of here? Sometimes I get a lot of those letters. But when it's around social issues, it runs about 9-1 on matters of human sexuality. And that intrigues me. The upside inside of my own spirit is that people are engaged and they're interested. And a high level of engagement is not a bad thing. What gives me some pause is the vacuum that I believe is created on so many other matters that the Christian faith and the United Methodist Church either has spoken or needs to speak. So this is an unplanned litany: violence, immigration, poverty, etc. We actually have some profound positions on that as United Methodists, not perfect positions, but positions that I can certainly more than live with. I think they're very faithful, in some cases pretty positively assertive. And so I just sometimes wonder why I don't hear more about those. People write and say, well, when are you going to say something about this if there's something about human sexuality out there? But I don't get a lot of people saying, Bishop, sure wish you'd say more about the violence of our culture or about the generational poverty. And maybe they think those problems have already been solved. I can't imagine that. We know they have not been decisively addressed by the church or by the societies that are United Methodists. And so I was reading a text the other day in the book of Acts where Paul, I think this is in the 20th chapter, was talking about the ways in which he had tried to be faithful. But he uses this phrase, when I was among you, I attempted, or I did, preach the whole counsel of God. That's the phrase I want people to remember, the whole counsel of God. So how do we as a church convey the whole counsel of God? God has deep interest in a great number of subject matters that I don't often hear from some of God's people about.
Are you planning on having any opportunities for people within the church to express their opinions related to human sexuality and the special session of the General Conference?
I've gone to some gatherings, and there are some scheduled and more to be scheduled when I'll get out and move around the conference in some meaningful way, saying, here's the work of the commission and the Council of Bishops to date. And I think some of that will be important prior to the Council of Bishops reaching its conclusion, and I think even more important after it does. So meeting with our General Conference delegation would be one, but that delegation in comparison, while representative of the conference, in comparison is small. So I'll need to get out into other places with lots of constituencies. And my interest will not be so much the marketing, but certainly trying to explain, if that's necessary, or to offer clarity about what the proposal says. And in some cases, that means saying this is not what it says. Because in any legislative proposal, questions help us to tease out, does it mean this or does it mean that? Or what's an unintended meaning? And those are important conversations to have that I want to do. So after May, there'll be lots of time, and hopefully there'll be some time during the annual conference session to do some of that, but not all of it.
What is your greatest concern for the United Methodist Church?
My greatest concern for the United Methodist Church is our honing our capacity to stay on mission, which, again, is about disciple making, and it is about the transformation of the world until it looks more like, to quote Wesley, God's new creation. Some people would say the reign of God, where not only individual lives are transformed by the risen Christ at work in the power of the Holy Spirit in the individual. That's what the gospel does. But also how that gospel, because of those people whose lives are changed, builds community, shapes community, not just for the people, quote, in the church, unquote, but that community helps to transform and redeem all of the communities that it's connected to. So whether or not it's people's places of work or their neighborhoods, et cetera. My greatest hope is that we will never lose sight of that promise of the gospel and what God is asking us to do. Now, here's my other concern that I believe, and they're related. So I'm concerned about how in our time, on our watch, and that would be over a long period of time, United Methodists, and I would say it's true in West Ohio, we have truncated the gospel of transformation, and we have shrunken down some key terms that ought to be broad for us. Let me be very specific. We have almost, in our church, defined holiness of heart and life around the conversation on human sexuality.
Explain that a little bit for me.
We've limited it to that almost. And we don't talk about, so go back to my male again. We don't talk about holiness of heart and life at all or nearly as robustly about the violence inside of each one of us and in our society and culture. And violence doesn't have to do always with the taking up of arms. It has to do with words. So that this is all connected back to the social media thing. Do these words on social media build up, or do they tear down and do harm and violate people and relationships and denigrate human beings? And it happens from all sorts of positional thinking. So there's no one group or person that is guilty of all of this. It's so I sort of let me use the word resent, but I'm just profoundly disappointed, and I have an emptiness at times that my church has shrunken down the conversation of what it means to live a holy life to human sexuality. Should human sexuality, human sexual practice be a part of the conversation on what a holy life looks like? Of course. The scriptures have much to say about that. But I want to say the scriptures are unambiguous about some other things that reflect holiness. I love that passage, for example, in 1 Peter in the 3rd chapter that says, "Seek peace and pursue it, for without holiness no one shall see the Lord." Some connection between peace, the heart of peace, peaceful relationships, healing and reconciliation, and holiness. So I think holiness, which is at the core of our United Methodist tradition, living a life of holiness, moving on to perfection, as Mr. Wesley and others talked about, cannot be shriveled down to one topic. Am I living a holy life if I'm engaged in the accumulation and hoarding of more than I need? How does God see me? Do I look holy to God? And you see what I'm trying to say. So that when you say, what are my concerns for the church? It's not being on mission and is shrinking down the conversation about holiness to one, maybe two subjects. May I say, even in the politics of the church, when I hear the terms progressive and conservative, not my terms I hear thrown around, we pretty much define who are the progressives and who are the conservatives around human sexuality in the United Methodist Church. But we don't so much bring that language, those nomenclatures, into our other conversations. Or shall we say, let the other conversations, violence, poverty, etc., into how we see people, which is why labels are increasingly unhelpful in our conversations. So those are, if I had a third concern, this is probably more than you want to know, a third concern, it would be our very quick capacity to label one another. And when we label one another, and I think we all do it to some degree, so that would be me too. I sometimes wonder if I'm labeling you so I can manage my relationship with you, which then doesn't really make me, as I'm wired, open to really knowing who you are, nor does it let me be transparent and as vulnerable as I might be in saying who I am or what I think and what I feel. Because if I think you perceive me as a progressive or a conservative or somewhere in between, and let's say I want to be perceived that way, then I'll stay inside of a little box and I'll use the vocabulary that is suitable to that. I think that makes us shrunken, and it does not make our relationships as authentic as they might be. So that's my deep concern in three movements.
How is it with your soul, Bishop?
I am at peace at this moment, not just because I'm looking at you and talking into this microphone, but I've been working on a heart of peace, and some of that work, being reintroduced to that work of the Anatomy of Peace and the Arbinger Institute, which really helped to frame a lot of the work of the Commission on a Way Forward and the work of the Council of Bishops in this season, I had to take it seriously. I'd read the book, listened to the tapes, and it was useful. But it was for me more words. Now a part of my own spiritual examine, if you will, is asking of myself at the end of the day, or even at the end of an interaction, did I relate to that group or to those persons, whether it's family or friends or strangers, from a heart of peace? Or did I relate to them as someone whose heart is at war?
Wow.
So right now, I have a heart of peace, but it takes vigilance, and I don't want to let on that at every moment, every hour, I'm there. I want to be more and more truthful about the state of my soul, because at the end of the day, as the Beatitudes say, blessed are the poor in spirit. And, when you know you don't have it all together, you're in a far better position to access the power and presence of the risen Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit.
Any closing thoughts, Bishop?
You've been very generous, and I think I've said more than may be useful, but I said it all from a place of peace, and I hope it'll be received in that way.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We invite you to keep up to date with all our future podcasts by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or Stitcher. For additional information about everything happening at the West Ohio Conference, visit our website, westohioumc.org. You can also follow us on Facebook or Twitter. Do you have a suggestion or idea for a future episode? Send us an email at mychurchstory@wocumc.org.